Welcome to the Business of Story, where we connect you with the leading minds in the art of business storytelling. Learn from best-selling authors, Hollywood screenwriters, makers, content marketers, and brand raconteurs on how to craft and tell compelling stories that sell. The Business of Story is brought to you by Emma, which provides innovative email marketing tools and services that drive brilliant results. And by Convince and Convert, digital marketing advisors and counselors to leading brands and organizations worldwide. Convince and Convert helps you gain and keep your customers online. Here's your host, Park Howell.
Hey, Park Howell here. Welcome back to Business of Story. Great to have you here today.
I've got a question for you. Do you remember that one teacher or professor that you had that made that remarkable impact on your life? It was just something about how they taught their courses and really connected with you. Well, I've got one in particular. I've got several, actually, but one, there was a history professor of mine at Washington State University, and this was a gentleman who you would actually have to go and line up, get there a couple of hours in advance to sign up for his class. He was that popular. He spent a number of years, 3 decades at Washington State University, and the thing that I remember most about his course is the power of storytelling. I didn't realize it at the time, but he would captivate us with the stories that he would share, just to share with us what the history was all about. It wasn't rote learning. It was absolutely lore learning. And we got him on the show today. I got to tell you how this came about. I was traveling back from Orange County about a month ago doing a workshop with a bit large organization out there, and for whatever reason, the universe tapped me on my shoulder, and this gentleman popped into my mind. His name's LeRoy Ashby, and I was killing some time at John Wayne Airport, and I decided to pulled out my iPad, jumped on there, and looked up LeRoy. I thought, where is he? Well, he had retired, and he lives up in Spokane, Washington. And I didn't know it at the time, but I learned that he had written this book called With Amusement for All, A History of American Popular Culture since 1830. And I thought, man, what a perfect marriage of a guy that really knew his history stuff, but in how he presented it through storytelling. And now he's written a book about pop culture and how pop culture has impacted our histories. Everything from reflecting the Industrial Revolution, making fun of and calling out social reform, to even getting presidents elected. And the power of story that is found in the amusement world, literally from 1830 to where we are today. This is a 900-page tome. And when I got a chance to get on the phone with LeRoy, I said, wow, where did you get all of this information? How long did it take you? It must have really been great effort. And he said, no, it's just what I always loved doing. Studying history, how it's impacted us in all levels. And so I invited him on the show. And he said, to my great delight, yes. And today I have an extraordinarily special guest, especially in my heart, because LeRoy had a tremendous impact on me as a kid going to Washington State University and graduating with a communications degree. And I thought, too, that his timing for the show was perfect, given what we have just gone through in this election cycle, and the Trump, our president-elect now, and how it mirrors so much of what he talked about in his book, even dating back to the 1830s. So I invited LeRoy to come on to the show today. Glad to have him here, and now I'm going to be a student of his once again, and honored to share him with all of my listeners. LeRoy Ashby, welcome to Business of Story.
Thank you, Park. This is a wonderful opportunity for me to connect again with you, and I'm delighted. I feel after that introduction we should just stop right there while I'm still ahead.
Well, I remember this was New Year's 1984, and we had all of us students were coming back from the west side of the state. I grew up over in the Seattle area, and we have to travel across the Cascade Mountain Range, and we had one hellacious snowstorm come through. And so a lot of us were fighting our way up and over Snoqualmie Pass on I-90, making our way to Pullman, about a 5.5-hour drive. And I remember getting stuck in a snowdrift, having to spend the night in Othello. So we didn't even make it in one pass. And I believe they even canceled the first day or two of school because people had such a hard time getting back to campus. My first class that I went into when I got back was yours. And I remember that you came out and you did like a 3-minute soliloquy of what all of us, grand adventures of students at Wazoo did to make our trek back to this wonderful campus and get ourselves back in our seats so that we could, progress along with our education. And I just remember, I think you even had actually, you did a Washington crossing of the Delaware type thing. I think you even came out in some sort of jacket of George Washington or whatever. But I just remember how powerful that was, this sort of combination of pop culture storytelling and how you connected with us all in your history courses.
Thanks. As you're telling the story, I'm reminded of how stories grow. I don't remember the George Washington jacket, for example, but that was fine.
Well, that's my truthiness coming out, I guess. But that's what we're going to talk about today. And this is on the heels, again, of our really incredible election and what the aftermath of that. I produced a show with Randy Olson that we recorded the day after the election, and he talked at great length about how Trump literally trumped the Clinton campaign through his use of narrative structure and storytelling. And that's why this is actually kind of a part B of that show in my mind, because I would love for you to take us back and kind of compare, as I've read in your book, P.T. Barnum and how these two personalities between P.T. Barnum and the Donald seem to be the same person, just separated by about 200 years.
Yeah, P.T. Barnum is the place to start. Trump himself said a while back that, in fact, he said we need a new P.T. Barnum, and because we have to build up the image of our culture. And he has referenced P.T. Barnum a number of times. P.T. Barnum wrote a book called The Art of Money Getting, and Trump, of course, wrote his own autobiography calling it The Art of the Deal. So you even see some similarities in that particular regard. Reminder about P.T. Barnum, who in the 19th century basically created what we think of as modern American entertainment. Started off with kind of a traveling show, taking freaks or oddities around, as they were called. One was supposed to be a 161-year-old slave who supposedly had actually weaned George Washington. And he took this old woman on a train up through various towns in New England, put her on display, charged admission, and the idea was that here was this woman, first of all, 161 years old, and secondly, somebody who had in fact raised George Washington, little George. And he really cashed in on that and was a remarkable success then at marketing. In fact, when it came to marketing, what he would do is then put out advertisements in local papers saying that she, this woman, Joyce Heth, was a fraud. And then people who had paid once to see her would then come back to see again to see what the fraud was. So he really was a genius when it came to marketing, and that's where I think there's another connection with Donald Trump. Another thing about Trump in that particular regard is that Trump very much, of course, comes out of entertainment. He had beauty pageants, professional football team he owned at one point, pro wrestling, reality TV, all of those kinds of things. And through all of this is the art of the sell, self-promotion. And think of P.T. Barnum then coming into a circus, one of the founders of the modern circus, and Barnum then would ride around in front of the fans, the crowd, and he would shout, well, I suppose you want to come and see Barnum. Well, I'm Barnum. And I think again of Trump, who continually does that very kind of thing. So that particular analogy, I think, very much holds up. Some other things with P.T. Barnum in that regard. P.T. Barnum always felt a little unhappy with the elites in society. These were people who kind of looked down on him. He was pretty much, as they saw it, a flim-flammer out there. And I think from what I've been able to read, Donald Trump has also felt like an outsider in New York, that he came from across the river into Manhattan, and that the Manhattan elites have sort of looked down on him. And so I see in Trump, from what I've read about him, a similarity with Barnum in that regard too. This idea of getting back at those people who took him lightly. As you know, recently Time magazine named Trump as the person of the year. And I think it's interesting that they dismissed him. They say in this article, critics have dismissed him as a vulgarian, a carnival barker, a showman with big flash. Their disdain gave him his strengths. And that particular comment about Trump very much, I think, could be written about P.T. Barnum, the carnival barker, the so-called vulgarian, showman, big flash, and yet those criticisms gave Barnum, as they apparently have Trump, some additional incentive, this desire he's going to prove himself. But again, Trump, in terms of marketing, at one point he had a Swiss bearded lady, which he put on display. This is supposed to be a woman who grew a beard like a man, and he not only put her on display, but because he had a big museum at one particular point. It was the most popular thing at that time around in the country. It was the modern Disney World or Disneyland back then. And so he actually paid somebody to sue him for this fraudulent bearded lady. And then a trial came out of that. And the whole thing was that from Barnum's point of view, it made no difference what people were saying. He was getting attention. And I think, again, one sees that very much with Donald Trump.
Yeah, and it goes back to the whole thing about reality. They just completely blur reality. It doesn't matter what is real, the truthiness of it, just so that they can get their names and faces up on the big board.
Right, yeah. And in fact, Barnum said, somebody would call me a charlatan. So much the better for me. It helped to advertise me. And there's so many ways which then Trump, if you look at his entertainment career, follows that kind of thinking. I mean, remember at one point he was with WrestleMania, and he in fact appeared on 2 editions. And one famous one, he tackled the impresario of professional wrestling, Vince McMahon, tackled him, and then he shaved his head. And his wrestler was able to beat Vince McMahon's wrestler. It was called a Battle of the Millionaires. And then just yesterday, Donald Trump appointed Vince McMahon's wife, Linda, to head the Small Business Administration. that connection continues. But the pro wrestling is always about hype. It's about confrontation. It's about insults. It's about chest-beating bravado. It's about grandstanding. In the 80s, there was a guy ravishing Rick Rude, and he would come out and insult the audience. He would call them fat, ugly sweat hogs. And in that regard, I think of the last round of primary debates where Trump would attack then fellow Republicans as what Lion Ted, Little Marco, dumb as a rock Jeb. The whole idea of trash talking, stereotyping, that comes right out of pro wrestling. And in that sense, I think you get that connection with entertainment and Donald Trump. Also, insult comedy. I think that's another example. Whether it's an early version like Don Rickles, or later you have then Howard Stern, you have Andrew Dice Clay, but the whole idea again of mocking people, making fun of them. And in the debates that were going on this past year, a lot of people couldn't understand why Trump was going after his fellow Republicans that way. Again, it just fit with that pro wrestling kind of mantra.
Yeah, the pop culture, this sideshow, if you will, because pro wrestling is definitely a sideshow. Can you take us a little bit through the history of the concept, the social constructs of the big top, the big tent where the, quote unquote, the circus took place, but then the sideshows that always surrounded those circuses, because I find that a fascinating parallel to what we have just witnessed and the fact that we really have not changed one bit in 200 years.
Yes, no doubt about that. I found very useful this concept of the big tent and the sideshows. And the idea there being, if you think of the big tent, the circus, that's where the main acts were. That's where you had the trapeze acts. That's where you had the elephants come in and parade. This was supposed to be the family side of the circus. Bring the little kids, have them come in, and this would be aimed at everybody.
And that was the cleaned up version of the entertainment, and it really more appealed to the bourgeois, is that right, versus
Exactly.
the rough and tumble Bowery folks?
Right. Those folks would go then to the sideshows, and these would be in the smaller little tents around the big tent, and in them you would find all kinds of acts, many of them kind of exotic, a number of them quite erotic. Some of them, in fact, were supposed to be closed to kids. Little kids would sneak around the back of the tent and peek in and try to get a flash of nudity and things like that. But the whole idea of that was not the respectable part of entertainment. Those sideshows, they were out there for the great unwashed, for the people who came in from the New York Bowery, for example. And what has happened, I think, in fact, I think it's the history of American entertainment, is how bit by bit those sideshows have gotten into the big tent. And it's not a matter that they snuck in, although in some ways they did, but it was a remarkable kind of dialectic or dialogue or exchange between those who ran the big tent, who wanted to make sure audiences continued to come in, and if they're going to continue to come in, they can't be bored. So the idea is you've got, again, I think of Donald Trump in that regard, who said the problem with politics is it's too boring. So in that regard, you got to bring the sideshow into that big tent. But by bringing in sideshows here and there, you would then try to titillate the audience a little bit more, try to provoke them a little bit more, just keep them coming in, because the same old thing, it may be quite acceptable and quite respectable, but after a while, it gets to be something that you don't want to continue to pay to see. So there's this constant jockeying between the big tent and the people who run it and make their money off of it, and the people who then run those sideshows. And in some cases, the people who are in the big tent are also the people who are making money out on the sideshows. So Barnum, a good example of that, because when he had his big tent, famous Balaam and Barnum circus later, he also operated several of the sideshows. And the sideshows dealt with all kinds of these freak shows and stuff like that.
And so here we are today with this exact same thing having happened. The sideshow of Donald Trump and all he stands for, making his way into the big tent of politics and looking for that, I guess, that affirmation from the the business elite in New York. So in a lot of respects, you know, what you write about in Amusement for All, Amusement for All, is that he's kind of that Bowery person that wants to make his step into the bourgeois, the higher level, but he has to do it through these sideshow antics, and it worked for him. Why do you think it worked for him?
Well, again, you get back to the genius of Barnum, marketing, very critical to all this too, but a real sense of what audiences needed. And so he was able to kind of psych out what the middle class wanted, what the lower types wanted. He himself had spent time in the Bowery, so he knew those people who lived there, the sort of great unwashed, and he had a good deal of respect for them. And that's why when it came to his museum, he always let them come in. His idea was, well, they pay the money too. It might not have made some of the upper class or middle class people happy, but so be it. So he was able, on one hand, to appeal to the Bowery types because he knew them. On the other hand, he was always searching for this respectability, always searching to enlarge his cache of money. And so to do that, he knew he had to sort of make the adjustments, trim those sails, if you will. So when it came then to his museum, which had on one floor all of these exotic exhibits, the Fiji mermaid and so forth, and then on another floor, he would have his auditorium, and that's where they presented plays. And interestingly enough, on that level, increasingly he would bring in plays that appealed then to the middle class. One of the best plays at that time, one of the most popular, was 10 Nights in a Barroom. And it was an anti-liquor presentation. Barnum himself had once been virtually an alcoholic and then had gotten off of the bottle altogether, destroyed all of champagne and whiskey he owned, did that one night. And so he opened up then this theater to showing temperance dramas, and 10 Nights in a Barroom being the classic example. So he's able on that floor then to lure in people who came from the so-called respectable classes. Meanwhile, on another floor, with all those exotic kinds of things, even erotic, he was able to bring in people who were less reputable. And so he had this intuitive sense of how to appeal to different kinds of audiences. I think it was a rare thing. It's really genius, no doubt about that. And he, as much as anybody in the 1800s, bridged that gap between those highbrow, lowbrow kinds of audiences. And that would be his success. If you think then in terms of Donald Trump, he comes through reality TV, which has a kind of trashy side to it. And yet at the same time, he's able to use that to his own advantage. And I think, again, in that regard, it's sort of a matter of hitting back at those people who think that they're better, who think that somehow they know more. So going back to Barnum, he liked to tweak elites, those people who thought they knew a lot, and at the same time appeal then to the common masses. And he would do that with an exhibit called the Fiji Mermaid. This was supposed to be...
What was the Fiji Mermaid?
It was supposed to be a fish with a head of a mermaid, which had been found somewhere in the South Seas. And he put that on display. Now, people who looked at it wondered, is this really a fish with a mermaid's head? Or is it, in fact, a fish, a body of a fish, with a monkey head sewn on? So Barnum put that on display. And then he had lecturers come in and make a case for both how it's phony and, on the other hand, how it's legit. And then he would ask the audience, the paying people looking at it, what do you think? And in that question, in other words, he was legitimizing the opinions, the analyses of lower class people, many of them quite uneducated, and saying that their point of view had as much weight as did that of the most educated people in the country. So that all fits, of course, with the growing democracy in the country, Jacksonian democracy and all of that. At the same time, it would show then this way of kind of, for Barnum, hitting back at those people who thought they knew so much. And in effect then saying, gee, these little people out here, they have as much right to say what is true and what is not. And I'm reminded the idea of truthiness. When you get to Colbert, it's what you want to believe. And so I think, again, you get back to the idea of genius, whether it was marketing, whether it was coming up with a particular kind of balance in an exhibit that would appeal to different groups, whether it was a matter of then suing himself in order to get more publicity, or whether he was writing a book on how to make money and being quite open about, well, this is what I do. I make money, and I've made a lot of it, and I feel pretty darn good about it. So that would be Barnum, and I keep thinking as I'm talking here, in many ways I could be talking about Donald Trump.
Yeah, he just seems to be the embodiment of him. So my question to you then is, here's Donald Trump born with the silver/golden spoon in his mouth. I mean, for crying out loud, he's got a golden toilet in his Trump Tower. How has he been able to connect so thoroughly with this disenfranchised bunch of Americans who believe that this billionaire, supposed billionaire, won't return, release his taxes, is actually fighting for them? How does he pull that off?
you deal with storytelling, of course, with your program all of the time. And that's where you get into one of those stories that, or narratives that cuts through American culture. And that's the self-made man, the whole idea of the person who is wealthy and is a success. And you get this audience appreciation for the person who made money. At the same time, you have some concerns and suspicions about that individual too. But what I'm saying is the whole idea of making money in America has been a way in which you've had all kinds of celebrities emerge, popular heroes who would emerge. And in that regard, golly, I think of Trump, who is out there. He inherited, as you said, money. He got the $1 million loan or whatever. But I remember a few weeks ago, I was checking out of the grocery store check stand, and I had a copy of a newspaper, and the headline said something about Trump got millions from his father. And the fellow who was checking me out looked at that headline and said, golly, I thought Trump was a self-made guy. I thought he made the money on his own. And so what I'm saying here is you get that kind of disconnect between how Trump really started out in business and the popular perception of how he did it. And that, I think, is critical to explaining how people who don't have much money can see in Trump somebody who speaks for them, somebody who will help them, somebody who's good for them. And so the self-made man is one of the most compelling narratives in American culture. Whether one is thinking about Ben Franklin on one hand, or coming on up then to the modern period, you think of novels like the Horatio Alger stories, very popular in the 1800s, about the little kid who starts off, he's poor, and he works his way up into success. Or the best-selling novel, The Virginian, came out in 1902, and it's about a cowboy. But by the end of that novel, the cowboy has become one of the wealthiest landowners in all of Wyoming. So you do get that theme. If you make the money, that is an indication of your talents, of your success. And so that's kind of the model of being a hero. As I said, though, this often cuts another way because having that money can also make you kind of a target. You know, Rockefeller ended up being, by the 1930s, an easy target for people to go after. So you have that constant dialectic or dialogue between how one is going to interpret that story and that whole idea of when you're going to tell a story, it's you start off by saying what? You can start off by saying what you wouldn't say in the beginning, although you could. Typically, you start off by saying once upon a time. Well, then what do you do with that once upon a time story? How does it play out? And you have different voices, different narratives. As somebody said, when you hear the story about, let's say, hoofs, they're pounding on the ground, do you think horses or do you think zebras? Again, that matter of perception, the matter of how you look at it. So when it comes, let's say, to views of a scientist, we have, again, things that cut both ways. You have the mad scientist in so many of those old 1930s kinds of movies. You also have the kind of bumbling incompetent who's the absent-minded professor. So you have that view versus then the people who are doers. They don't think. They, in fact, the one says a popular way of saying it, those who can do, those who can't teach. Or look at that, the guy's gone 4 years to college, he doesn't know how to load a truck. You get to Andy Jackson, who was accused of not being able to spell right. And the idea was, no, he's too smart to spell the same word the same way all the time. So what I'm saying is you get this sort of bifurcated view of things. I'm taking a long way around to talk about the whole idea of Trump being wealthy, but then being a spokesperson for people who don't have wealth. And the point I'm trying to illustrate here is that those narratives always have several levels of meaning to them. Does that help, or am I talking too much?
No. It's good, and want to jump over to this idea of what truly is reality. And with Trump having his own reality TV show for 10 years, it put him in the public's eyes as big paternal figure. You're fired. I mean, it was
Yeah.
just in some cases kind of this grotesque icon of corporate America, but people could rally behind him, I guess, because they looked at him as a father figure, and he was completely in control. But the concern I have with that, and it is captured by Gwenda Blair, Trump's biographer, when she writes, I think, again, this is about his reality TV show, I think that it has imprinted on a lot of people that they trust him, that makes him trustworthy. That combined with the reality TV phenomenon in which it became acceptable to have something that wasn't really true, legitimized a kind of not quite true thing, and shifted our idea of what's an acceptable version of reality. And so now we find ourselves electing presidents, and maybe they've all done this in their own way, but he just hasn't, at least in my opinion, done it in such a pop cultural sort of way, come out, completely share untruths, and nobody seems to care. And I'm wondering, is that also reflective of the P.T. Barnum days? And what does that say about our society and the decisions we're making when we don't so much care about the truth of something, we're much more interested in the theater of it?
Yeah, good questions. Recently the whole term post-truth has gotten into the Webster's dictionary, going beyond the world that we used to think we know about what's true and what evidence is and so forth. And when Trump indeed seems to play with truth, I like, again, Colbert's idea of truthiness, then I think we're on to something larger in the American culture. Ronald Reagan said it once, you believed it because you wanted to believe it. And there's nothing wrong with that. I do it all the time. So you do have, I think, this tendency, and Hollywood is, I think, a good embodiment of that, of creating these worlds up there on the screen that people can identify with. They may be lands far away, they may be about people you can never get to be like, but there's still this kind of celebrity appeal. You want to be like them. And Trump is, first and foremost now, I think, a celebrity coming into the White House. I think Reagan was too, and in a sense, Reagan points to Trump. But you're still touching on this larger question of what is it now that makes things such as truth and evidence up for grabs? Remember, Karl Rove said at one point in an interview from the New York Times Magazine, when he was talking about reporters, he was saying, you try to report on reality. We are creating reality, as if, again, there are these two different worlds. And this is a worrisome kind of trend, I think, and that is when facts are up for grabs, and of course, facts have always been debatable, but I mean, when the evidence itself often comes down to deliberately phony false stories, and people can believe them, then I think we're into some really, kind of quicksand stuff. This rumor, for example, about a pizza place that was another stand-in for child molestation, and the guy in Washington, D.C. walked in the other day and shot up the place because he believed that false story. And I think Trump has fed off of that. You may recall at one point during the debates, Trump was going after people like Little Marco and Lion Ted, and the story had just come out. It was in the National Enquirer, and that story said that Ted Cruz had 5 affairs. Trump was asked about that, and he did not deny it, but he added, I think kind of slyly, well, fact is, the National Enquirer has been right about O.J. Simpson and John Edwards and many others. I hope they're not right about Lion Ted Cruz. So you're at I think a major moment there where the National Enquirer, which had long been looked at as sort of trash talk journalism, becomes then a source that seems to have some legitimacy. Trump not saying, yeah, I believe that story, but at the same time saying, on the other hand, what the National Enquirer said about Simpson, O.J. Simpson, and John Edwards, that was true. I hope they're not right about Lion Ted Cruz.
Mm-hmm.
So it's worrisome for me that there are these efforts, and they're all around now, it seems, to play with what is really something you can back up with evidence. And it comes down to simply what you want to believe is true, and that's good enough. Several of Trump's assistants have been interviewed recently about this post-truth world, and they said some amazing things, such as, well, to the reporters, you take that stuff seriously. His followers believe that because they want to believe it, and it's a crazy kind of a world in that sense. Barnum, I think, played with that too, to come back to him. But I think with Barnum, and maybe it is true of Trump too, Barnum was always winking when he said that. The whole idea that he was a charlatan, he played off of that. In fact, he called himself the king of the humbugs. Humbug was a term at that time used for being a charlatan. And so he would play off of that. But the idea was that he also could be then the beloved rogue, a trickster. He could say those things which seemed to be absurd, but the public would like him for doing that.
Because he was true to himself. He was the authentic.
He was true to himself, exactly.
Way, inviting them into the story. Saying, look, this is basically an act I'm putting on, and you are an important part of this act. And so he could, out of one side of his mouth, play the trickster, and on the other side say, but this is all just fun, so play along with me. And they could create the truth out of it they wanted to.
Exactly, and at that same time, he could be tweaking then the so-called intelligent folks, the so-called elites, kind of mocking them. At the same time, he was doing that. But yes, I think you're summing it up very, very well. For the bottom line there basically is, if it's true, if you want to think it's true.
Yeah.
And
well, let's take a break at this moment so our sponsors can share their stories. And when we come back, LeRoy, I would love to explore just a little bit more of what has impacted you most that we can learn from about Donald Trump and his storytelling capabilities. We call him a genius in some cases, and he is, but it's also fairly frightening at the same time. So let's cover that right after these messages.
Hey, I've got a question for you. What's the best call to action button color on your website? Yeah, you probably didn't see that one coming, did you? Well, what's the best shape and sizes of your CTA buttons? And what copy gets more clicks? These questions have interrupted my sleep patterns for weeks now, until I downloaded a helpful new email marketing guide from Emma called Why We Click: The Psychology Behind a Great Call to Action. You'll learn how applying just a little bit of brain science can transform your CTA buttons into small but mighty conversion powerhouses. It covers the button color, copy, and placement that helps skyrocket click rates. Check it out at myemma.com/click. Emma helps marketers everywhere send smart, stylish email newsletters, promotions, and automated campaigns, and help us all rest a little easier knowing our email marketing is doing its job. So check out their new publication at myemma.com/click. You, like all business leaders and communicators, have an important brand story to tell, but it's probably not being heard. There's just too much competition for our attention, unless, of course, you tell a better story. For over a year now, I have connected you with more than 50 international story artists through this podcast to help you craft your ideal brand story for the growth of your enterprise and your people. Did you know I'm also available to you for speaking engagements, brand and leadership story workshops, even for one-on-one Skype or telephone brand story strategy consults? Plus, you can begin clarifying your brand story right now by downloading the interactive DIY workbook at businessofstory.com. You see, your sales don't have to be comedies or tragedies. You can make them epic by clarifying your brand story and connecting with audiences and customers like never before. So download your workbook today at businessofstory.com, and if you're not 100% satisfied, I'll happily refund your money. And one last thought. Just remember, the most potent story you ever tell is the story you tell yourself. So make it a good one, my friends. Story on.
Welcome back to Business of Story and our distinguished guest today, one of my favorite professors of all time, LeRoy Ashby. LeRoy has been in the history business for many, many years, teaching at Washington State University. Is this correct? From 1972 to 2008?
That is correct.
Yeah.
That is correct, yes.
And did you focus particularly on any one type of history? Did you have a specialty in that? I mean, you've got this book out that's just wonderful with Amusement for All, the history of entertainment and pop culture since 1830. Has that always been a love affair for you, and is that a specialty?
A very good question, because when I was going to school, and I'm talking about from grade school right on up through graduate school, at no point in any classroom can I remember a teacher bringing up popular culture or using it as something that was legitimate. All the way through graduate school, all the classes I took avoided anything about popular culture. It was considered to be, again, lowbrow, trivial, not worthy of our attention. So when I was in graduate school, I studied several fields, modern English history, for example, but mainly it was American history. But my training in American history was, as it traditionally was, on politics, economics, foreign policy, or culture. But culture didn't mean popular. It meant in terms of high culture. The philosophers in America. Studied Ralph Waldo Emerson, for example. And so in that sense, popular culture was looked on with utter disdain. And that always sort of bothered me, because as a kid, I had just kind of grown up on pop culture, comic books and movies, and so got have time to get serious. Now I'm in school. But when I began to teach, this would be late 60s, early 70s, there were several kind of pioneers, if you will, in the discipline of history, who began to write books about popular culture. I've been talking about P.T. Barnum, and one of those books came out from University of Chicago historian. It was called Humbug. And I remember reading that. It was around the early 70s when I read it. And I thought, this is great stuff. So when I went in to teach that period, the 1830s primarily at that point, I was drawing upon stuff about P.T. Barnum, trying to show him as an example. Or another book came out about that same time on the antebellum theater, the kinds of shows in which you'd have the villain come out and people would hiss him and so forth. And that book tried to show how that really reflected those larger democratizing trends that were at work. So I began to find that some people were writing about popular culture and doing so in ways that weren't simply dealing with kind of gossipy stuff, but trying to interpret it and show what this would tell us about the larger story of the United States. And increasingly, those books were coming out. More and more I began to work off of them. My own earlier research had been really on just two topics. One was on politics, and the other was on social welfare history dealing with children. But more and more I began then to find these compelling works on popular culture, use them in my own classes. And finally, around 1999, I came up with the idea, why not teach a class on American popular culture? That would be the whole course. And I started off as a one-semester class, and then a year later, I made it a two-semester class. So by that time, I was doing what I had long hoped I could do more of, and that was discuss popular culture. And then that book you referred to with Amusement for All kind of came out of teaching that class, and my work on that book went in to the teaching of my class. And so by the end of my career, I found a rewarding moment when my pop culture interests fused with what I thought was some teaching that told us some interesting things about the United States.
And you published the book in 2005 and then wrote a new intro to it, I think, in 2012. And that new intro, what really fascinated me about it, literally while I was in the John Wayne Airport, I downloaded it and I read that intro. It was basically a harbinger of everything to come in this election. You somehow, in what you captured there, captured what was going down in the election, and that was before the election had happened that I read this, and I'm going, oh my goodness. if what he says happens here compared to what happened back in the 1830s and 40s with Barnum, Trump's going to get elected. And I just didn't believe it. I just didn't believe a guy that could have so many missteps and be so out there in so many levels would actually win. But I also view this election as pop culture before I even knew about your book, pop culture versus political cronyism. Hillary was not the ideal candidate for most Americans as well. So it did create a vacuum for him to take over. And again, it seems like fiction trumped facts, quite literally, in the outcome of this election that was, sort of declared in the introduction of your book, written in 2012, or the new introduction, I should say.
Right. Yeah. I was looking at my book again last night, that introduction. I thought, hey, I wrote that. That's pretty prophetic stuff. I'm glad you picked up on that. It really is.
But it also, I think, speaks to a larger human condition of don't bother me with the facts. Was it Colbert that said, I never trust the facts? Facts can change, but my opinion never will?
Never will, yes. And I think that has a real appeal to it, especially as the world becomes much more complex and you get all these competing kinds of theories about what's happening. It's kind of nice to be able to hang on to something that seems certain, that you're secure with, and that comes down again to your beliefs. I'm intrigued as we're talking here about popular culture and politics in terms of, one, how pop culture, coming back to that sideshow Big Ten idea, how pop culture has gotten involved in presidential politics. I mean, you go back very far, and it simply wasn't there. You would have pop culture out in local elections with strawberry pea pickers, for example, but you would not find that in a national presidential campaign. When you get to Franklin Roosevelt, he used the radio, popular entertainment, but he really was not an entertainer in that sense. Or then you get to Adlai Stevenson running in 1952, and he has to have an advertisement running for president. And he said, politics isn't soap opera. This isn't Ivory Soap versus Palm Olive. So it was this kind of disdain view of using advertising in politics or trying to sell somebody as a president. Along comes John Kennedy, who made good use of TV, sort of camera made, and a major moment for him was when Marilyn Monroe, at his birthday party, sung up in this big auditorium and sang, classic pop culture moment, meeting politics, saying, "Happy birthday, Mr. President." Then we get to Ronald Reagan. You bring in the entertainer. The guy who'd been in radio, he'd been in movies, been in television, the Las Vegas Act, he'd been in advertising. And as one person said, the Ronald Reagan show ran from 1967, when he became governor, to 1989, when he left the White House.
The popular Ronald Reagan show in the White House, huh?
Yes, in the White House, yeah. So bit by bit, more and more, politics has opened up then to pop culture. You get to Bill Clinton. He appeared on the Arsenio Hall show, late night talk show, and he got out his saxophone and he broke into Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel. Now, even then, there were some people who were sort of put off by that. What is a serious presidential candidate doing on an evening talk show, playing the saxophone like that? Bit by bit, I think those walls have been crumbling. And in that sense, the door was opening for a Donald Trump to come through. Mm-hmm. I mean, what was once strictly out there as a sideshow kind of politics became, with Donald Trump, the main show, the big tent. And the second thing that comes to mind is that even though politicians, presidential candidates, presidents have not necessarily used pop culture references like to Elvis Presley, they have drawn upon pop culture kinds of narratives. It was Robert Reich, who a number of years ago wrote an article talking about those pop culture narratives that presidents have used, even if they don't necessarily believe in them that much. And so one of those views would be the idea of the little guy who can make it. And it's simply out there, the Horatio Alger kinds of stories. And in that regard, it's people just tap into them again and again and again. They portray themselves that way, or their people surround them portray them that way. So this would be the narrative to kind of sum up what it would be called, it would be the self-made man narrative. We've talked a little bit about that. But another narrative is one, according to Robert Reich, is the rot at the top. The rot at the top. And this would be then the idea of beware of those evil, powerful elites, whether they're, in modern terms here, those reporters from the New York Times, or those wealthy aristocrats, or more importantly, imperious government officials, the bureaucracy. And you end up with a whole avalanche of tales there. You go back again to old melodramas, the bad guy coming out on the stage, he's got the hood he pulls up when the audience hisses at him. He gets progressive era muckraking novels dealing with corrupt business people. You get to a movie like Chinatown. You get to some TV stories in which you have, again, the theme of simply bad guys out there, the rot at the top. Bob Dylan would say, to live outside the law, you must be honest. In other words, those who are inside that tent are there because they're typically corrupt. Or then another of those narratives, according to Robert Reich, is the benign community. And that is the way that we save ourselves is by pitching in to help each other. Frank Capra's It's a Wonderful Life comes to mind. And save us against whom? Well, another theme would be the mob at the gates, them versus us. And here again, Trump comes to mind when he talks about them, and they may be then what? Immigrants, and they may be Muslims, they may be, and here you get all of that kind of campaigning that he very much used, engaging us against them, little folks against them. So what I'm saying here is that even though for years presidential candidates or president did not necessarily use pop culture analogies directly, they drew almost implicitly upon some of those narratives that have very much shaped American culture and certainly American popular culture.
Yeah, are these very archetypal, primal narratives that are just kind of already baked into our psyche and they're simply taking advantage of them? And if so, do they know they're doing that, or are they just doing it as inherently good storytellers?
That's really tough question to answer. I'm not sure that I can. I think that those narratives are sort of like culture generally. They're like the air we breathe. They're simply there, and we often don't even think about them. It's just that's the world we know. It's the world we've been taught. It may be the story of the winning of the West, one of the most familiar, one of the most popular in all American history. So on one hand, you do have that. It's just there. On the other hand, there's no doubt about it. There have been some efforts to milk those ideas. When Richard Nixon was in the White House, at one point, there was an effort to make sure you invite then to a White House dinner Clint Eastwood. Why? Because this Dirty Harry character is really resonating out there. And if you can get Clint Eastwood in the White House, then you're able to sort of identify with that Dirty Harry point of view. So in that case, it was a conscious, strategic move. In other cases, I'm not sure if it's that conscious or strategic or not. But
and how powerful these pop culture stories are is in your book too. You talk about Jack Bauer became our John Wayne of the past 10, 15 years because he reflected the longest war we've ever had going against the war on terrorism, and he became the John Wayne of terrorism, so much so that some of even the politicians were kind of buying into, we need to be more like Jack Bauer, and somebody responded, you do realize that's a made-up personality,
Made-up personality, yes, exactly, yeah.
No, the power of storytelling. So the one other thing that trending around presidents that is really fascinating, from the radio all the way up through, how Obama certainly used the internet in his first round to get elected, and how expertly they pulled that off. But now you've got Donald Trump presumably tweeting at 3 a.m. from his golden throne, He's famous for his tweets. A lot of people would argue they're very unpresidential, in appearance. And in fact, there was quite a firestorm that came up from one lady that essentially called him out because he was on tweeting about his Alec Baldwin's representation of him on Saturday Night Live and how it wasn't funny and stupid and all this. And she's basically saying, look, you have a lot more to worry about than how you're portrayed on Saturday Night Live. Get with the program.
Right. Yeah. This use of tweeting is a new phenomenon for anybody who's going into the White House or going to be in the White House. And again, it's another example of that sideshow out there getting into the Big Ten itself. Mm-hmm. And Trump, of course, says that this is the way he connects with his people. People who tweet and are on Twitter, they understand what he's dealing with. I think, again, it's natural for Trump to be doing this. That's the way he's communicated for quite some time. I come back to the idea he enjoys tweaking, though, those people who think this is beneath what he or any president should be doing. There is that particular theme.
So, and that comes back to Barnum, that idea of let's show those snobs who's really in charge here.
Yes, right. Mm-hmm.
Very much so. Yeah. Have you ever considered writing another book comparing P.T. Barnum with Donald Trump? It would be a pretty fascinating look. I mean, if you just draw the parallels, just from the parallels I've already taken out of your book with Amusement for All, I mean, the timing of it would be really phenomenal.
Well, I appreciate the thought. I'm not sure how many words I have left, but I do appreciate that thought. It would be a good topic, and I think somebody needs to deal with it. We certainly live in the age of show business, and the way in which show business news, show business politics have become part of our way of life. That's not a new idea at all, but I think that we need to be more aware of it and more analytical about it.
Well, and what surprises me or impacts me, maybe this is my own thinking, but we all, I believe, as we get older as a nation and as people, we get more sophisticated and we supposedly get smarter and sharper. But when I look back and compare to where the American Republic was in 1830s and 40s compared to where we are now, there is virtually no movement in how we allow charlatans, pop culture to impact our lives, again, opting for drama over data. And I guess it's just the way our brains are hardwired. We love story, and we welcome those charlatans into our lives because we just want to live to a more interesting story than we maybe currently are living in our mundane lives.
Yeah, that's well put. I want to emphasize, though, too, that we've been talking about pop culture in terms often of the sort of bad effects it can have and has had. But I think pop culture, from another angle, has been one of the most dramatically altering forces in American culture for very good things. I'm thinking, for example, of what pop culture has done with, say, race relations. And I realize you can go back and find all kinds of racism cutting through from the minstrel shows on up. But at the same time, it would be in, say, baseball, the symbol of Jackie Robinson breaking that racial line. Or if you think in terms of attitudes toward gays and lesbians, that has changed remarkably in about the last 20 years. And some people have referred to the Will and Grace effect, referring to that TV show, Will and Grace, which they have been able to show through some polls, apparently changed a substantial number of people's public opinion, or their opinions, about the whole idea of homosexuality. And how did that develop? Well, it developed through this very sympathetic, understanding portrait on a TV show. I think there are numerous examples of that having happened. I think if you're thinking about race relations in America, you think about changing gender relations, pop culture has been a force for good as well as for bad, a force for progress as well as for throwing us back. So I think I'd want to get that out there on the record too.
And I'm glad you did. I know I've been a little bit focused on this whole thing because I am just completely amazed about the Donald president-elect and that that corresponding that parallel with P.T. Barnum, and even he mentions pulls up P.T. Barnum's name in all this. So I suppose I have been particularly focused on this, and you are absolutely right. Pop culture to me is a prism that not only reflects what's going on in culture and politics and whatever, but can also shape it for good and for bad, depending on the stories that it shares through music, through movies, TV, and so forth.
Right.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, LeRoy, I could go on all day long with you. This is absolutely fascinating. As we close, could you give us 3 of your insights that you have seen from Donald Trump, the storyteller, that have been like really striking, have made an impact on you, and something that we should continue to watch out for as we hear and watch and experience his story as the president-elect unfold?
Boy, tough questions. You want me to come up with, say, 3? Is that what you said?
No pressure.
I'm grasping for 1 or 2 at this point. Well, no, it seems to me that the idea of Trump as a celebrity is critical here. We allow a lot of latitude toward what celebrities can say and do. And Trump comes into the White House as a celebrity. I mean, you figure in those primary elections, there were 16 people he's running against. Who knew who was the governor of so-and-so? Who knew was the ex-governor of such and such? But everybody, it seemed, knew who Donald Trump was, the celebrity who came out of that show where he said, "You're fired." So in that sense, I think he's a reminder of the power of celebrity, and that carries both warnings and some reassurances with it, because a celebrity can have a huge effect in terms of setting the tone, in terms of providing a model. And Trump has given, I think, some worrisome signals, many of them, about what he's going to do. But there's still a lot that can happen. And I'm hoping that he would become this model for a number of good things, as I see them as good things, for changes that I would favor. Again, we get to my biases here. But it seems to me we need to keep an eye then on Trump, the celebrity. Because, yes, he's the president, but some people have said he really didn't want to be president when he started his campaign. He wanted to sell his brand. And so I think we need to keep that in mind. The second thing here would be then selling that brand, because this has been what most of his recent life has been all about. And as you know, there are concerns about conflicts of interest as he has these businesses scattered around the world. What will happen to the Trump brand? Because his brand is very much out there. And if things go bad for Donald Trump, things can go bad for his brand too. On the other hand, he can do a number of things to advance his brand, which may not necessarily be good for the country. So I think that's something else to keep in mind. Teddy Roosevelt referred to that bully pulpit, and I'm curious how Trump will use that bully pulpit. I'm concerned about how he is targeting still members of the press. And there's a real irony in that, because as much as anything, the press, the media, has made Donald Trump. I mean, CBS president had that marvelous and I think kind of scary line that Trump may be bad for the country, but he's certainly been good for CBS, again, in terms of making money. And so I think there's that to be concerned about, too, or to think about. So there's a couple of things. I think they might have been all under number 1, but I split them into 3. So,
do you see a positive in any of this?
Right now, candidly, no. But because right now, those signs that I've talked about are, I think, rather alarming. And I am concerned about Trump's loose use of facts, his disdain for facts, his very, very thin skin. And irony is he's done as much as anybody to advance his career off of the media and popular culture. And yet what gets him angry is the way in which he's portrayed on Saturday Night Live. I mean, I think most presidents of the past have either ignored what was in popular culture or they shrugged it off. Trump really seems to take the needle.
You take it personally.
That's right. And then he wants to get back. And there is that kind of vindictive side of him that we've seen too many times.
Yeah.
So I'm not reassured on any level at this point. The most I can say is I hope that we begin to see that other side. I mean, P.T. Barnum he opposed slavery. So I can find some good things in P.T. Barnum too. So I hope that Trump will emerge as the kind of model that will make us all proud.
Yeah. And my final question for you, in American pop culture history and all the studies you've done since 1830 on, what tells you that maybe if as history repeats itself, something good will come out of that? Can you point to any one thing?
Oh boy, something good, yeah. Jeez.
Maybe not, huh?
No, because again, I don't want to be cynical, overly cynical in that regard. I mean, when I think about the last 50 years in American history, things have happened that I did not think were possible. I did not think the United States would elect a black president in my lifetime. We did. I did not think there was a chance of a woman, I'm going back, say, 50 years ago, a woman becoming president. Well, Hillary Clinton did get more votes than anyone else running for president. So there have been those changes. I think in popular culture has been a monumental force in both of those developments, whether it's in terms of putting women on TV who are in prestigious positions, who aren't simply playing the dumb dolly kind of roles, but have really had some serious kinds of roles to play. And the same thing would apply to race. So yes, there has been change. In terms of, say, homosexuality, the kinds of tolerance that we've seen develop in a very, very short time really boggles my mind. What bothers me, of course, is the backlash, and this is invariably going to happen. But civil rights days, major moments in the 60s, breakthroughs in terms of civil rights laws, and now they're bit by bit we're whittling away at those. So it's a constant struggle. But overall, I guess Martin Luther King put it very well. The arc of history may be long, but it bends toward justice. I think that has to be our hope. I'm concerned about how long it takes to bend it, and I'm also concerned then about the efforts to push back against it, because pop culture has been a foil for politicians as well as something that some of them have used. I mean, think of the number of attacks on pop culture as being bad for the United States. And so if you want to go after something that's bad in the country, think of Dan Quayle going after the Murphy Show. I don't know if you remember that show or not, but the TV show. So it's something that people can attack. So Trump can then attack the press at the same time that he can then try to use it to his own advantage. So you get that back and forth, that dialogue, that dialectic. And I guess I have to hope that we are eventually working our way more and more toward a better world, a more just world. Right now, I'm a little concerned about the backlash elements of it, and my fear that maybe we're going to lose a lot of ground here. And to think in terms of the environment, we don't have much time to lose ground.
Yeah. Well, then all of this too is now he has to be accountable for all of those, falsehoods he shared out there.
Yes.
And the beautiful thing about the day and age of social media is everybody can keep him accountable and call it out, providing people are paying attention and have an appreciation for what is real and what is false. So with that, thank you so much, LeRoy, for joining us today. LeRoy Ashby, it's just been an absolute honor to have you on Business of Story, and I hope you have a wonderful holiday season.
Thanks, Park. My pleasure, and the same to you.
All right, and thank you all for listening to this edition. If you like what you're hearing, please visit me over on iTunes and let us know about it. Give us a rating and share it with your world. And, of course, if there's anything that I can do for you, visit me at businessofstory.com. We have now over 80 episodes, and I'm proud to say I just heard that we eclipsed the 100,000 download mark for the show. And so by the time you're hearing this, we will be well on our way to 110,000, 115,000. 15,000. So thank you for that. It's been a real pleasure bringing you story artists like LeRoy Ashby to help you understand how to better craft and tell compelling stories that sell. So thank you. If you have a guest in mind or something you would like for me to cover, please send me a note at park@businessofstory.com, and I will certainly circle back with you. And until next Monday, I want you to have the most wonderful life. Thanks for listening.
Thanks for tuning in to The Business of Story. Don't forget there are terrific free storytelling resources for you at thebusinessofstory.com, where you'll also find the complete show archive. The Business of Story is sponsored by Emma and by Convince and Convert, and is produced by Convince and Convert Media. Find more great shows like The Business of Story at marketingpodcasts.com, the first search engine for marketing podcasts. Podcast imaging by AudioBag.com.